Now this module A lab, we will try out Azure Firewall. Now with Azure Firewall, the goal is the firewall becomes the next hop for all the exiting traffic within the virtual network. So suppose that we have a VNet. Now Azure Firewall has to reside in a dedicated firewall subnet. So this being a firewall subnet. We'll be deploying a workload subnet. Okay. Now, under normal condition, workstation deployed into a subnet has direct access outbound to the internet. Okay. And be able to pretty much do any communication against the internet host on its own. Alright, so let's say we make this more interesting by deploying a few additional subnet. Controlling traffic between these subnets using exclusively NSG or ASG, the things we talked about in Lab 7, gets very complicated very quick. Okay, namely because the NSG and ASG applies to the NIC and to the subnet. So if I have 4 separate subnets, it's going to be very difficult if each subnet is allowed to communicate directly to another subnet and still apply NSG to control the traffic. It gets very messy very quickly. Okay, so for example, in order to control machine D, I would need to create rules when it head out to C, head out to B, head out to A. So there'll be 3 rules and it becomes very difficult to manage. A better approach is that we can direct traffic so it always lands on that firewall appliance first. Now this firewall appliance will be able to apply rules against web traffic, TCP/IP traffic, and then we can use a web-based management tool within Azure Portal to manage the rules. So what's left for us to do is to deploy the workload and make sure the workload does not try to go out onto the internet on their own. We want to make sure all these machines, when they send traffic outside of the subnet, a routing table will pass the traffic to the firewall and let those rules decide whether or not the traffic should flow. So that way we don't have to define rules within each subnet, within each NIC. So it's much more manageable. And when you have separate subnets and different isolated networks, Azure Firewall makes life a lot easier. Now, of course, there are many firewall vendors out there that can give you a virtual machine-based firewall. Now, none would be as polished and as integrated to the Azure portal as the one we're about to introduce to you. All right, so let's do it. All right, so here's the outline of what we will do. We'll use the ARM templates to deploy the virtual network. Get an Azure Firewall. This will take some time. Create the rules, default route, user-defined routes. Okay. To make sure a workload always send the traffic to the firewall as soon as the traffic leaves the subnet. All right, I'm going to set up application rule, network rule, and make sure that it actually works as described. Okay, so we're going to start by deploying a custom template. Now in the labs 08, there should be a template file. We're going to deploy this against a new resource group. All right, when the deployment succeeded, navigate to the virtual network. The virtual network we deploy through the template is called test FWVN. You can go down to the monitoring section and click on the diagram to see that there are 3 subnets. Okay. 1 VM in the workload, 1 VM in a jump. We have an empty subnet. That empty subnet has to be called Azure Firewall subnet for you to deploy an Azure Firewall into it. Okay, so it has to be one of those hard-coded names, just like Gateway Subnet. Alright, so let's go ahead and deploy an Azure Firewall appliance. Alright, so in the search, I'm searching for Azure Firewall, the first one that comes back. And you'll see other vendors' firewall as well. So I'm going to select Azure Firewall, create. Alright, so that's a firewall name. We already have a virtual network. We want to make sure we add a new public IP. We don't want to use the public IP that was assigned to another VM. So this should be the firewall public IP. Now when you try to deploy the firewall after you select virtual network, if you're getting an error, chances are there is no empty subnet. Remember, you must have an empty subnet called Azure Firewall subnet. Okay, so if it's not named such, you'll get an error message. Alright, so it takes about a good 5 minutes for the firewall to deploy. Now there's certain information we need, which is namely the private IP. Now the reason we need the private IP is so that we can deploy a user-defined route. So 10.01.4. That will be the next hop address for those user-defined routes. So here goes the route table. Alright, we're going to associate this user-defined route to the test firewall. Now, one of the things that may cause you to see a blank dropdown is your region. You have to make sure your firewall route, the route table, is in the same region as your virtual network. So if you put them in different virtual network, it will show up. Alright, so we want to apply this to the workload subnet. Now the route we're going to apply to the subnet is that all traffic that exits Okay, so once we apply this user-defined route against the subnet, any exit traffic out of the subnet will forward the traffic through the firewall. All right. So now the firewall gets to control whether or not to forward the traffic further. So the route we're creating is the default gateway to send it through virtual appliance, and this will apply to the workload subnet where this route table is associated. All right. Now we're going to switch over back to the firewall to start configuring some of these rules. All right. So we have application rules, network rules, and NAT rules. All right. So we're going to select application rule. All right. So here we're going to create a target rule. Okay, not a. This will be the target FQDN. All right. So this allows outgoing 80443 traffic with the destination of bing.com. All right. So when you go back to the application rule, I just want to highlight there are two sections. Okay. One uses FQDN tags. Now, these are some of the most common Microsoft infrastructure services, such as HD Insight, Kubernetes services. So, for example, all of my workstations needs to back up to Azure Backup, and I'll say, perhaps I should limit it to my subnet IP, but I'm not going to find out what that is. I'm just going to say star, wanting to go to Azure Backup or Windows Update, okay, because these we may not actually know what are the fully qualified domain name for these services are, and they might change over time. So with FQDN tags, it's much easier for us to create rules targeting these backend services from Azure. Now, if you know the specific domain, then you certainly can use target FQDN approach. Okay, so these help you set up rules. The next rule we're going to create is the DNS rule. Okay. Now this allows the DNS access to these two DNS servers. So any machines within that network is allowed to query those DNS on port 53. Alright, while the rule is creating, let's go to virtual machine and assign the server work, the DNS server that we have just allowed. So again, on the virtual machine, select networking, select network interface. Go to IP configuration. Alright, so sorry, not on the IP configuration, on the DNS server. And here is where we're going to specify which DNS server to use. And we're going to use those two IP addresses we created in the firewalls. Alright, so once this DNS setup is done, we're going to test it out by going to the jump box. So we have a SRV jump. Let's connect to it by RDP. Alright, so this is our jump box. We are going to use the jump box to get to the work VM. Okay. Alright, so this is going to navigate to the work VM. That's only accessible through the jump box. Now when you have the server manager up, click on local server and disable the IE enhanced security. Alright, so first we're going to test out the website rules, www.bing.com. Alright, so this works well. If you were to try to do any other website, you should get that message. Okay. There's no rule that matches the URL. Okay, so we know the application rule works. And the very fact that www.bing.com is able to resolve, as well as Google, that means the DNS outbound must be working. So this is the Azure Firewall in action. Alright, exit out the remote desktop. Clean up the resource group.